A long time ago, I began taking photographs of some of the model figures that I had painted. I feel that I learned quite a bit about composition and framing from taking these photos, and in the long run, it helped me become a better modeler than I'd been before I started. Eventually, my photography was what led me towards sculpting, after I came to the conclusion that the only way I could realize some of my ideas was to sculpt the figures myself. My first attempts at making my own figures were kung fu fighters. The reason I chose this subject was because I felt that the costumes would be easy, and there would be plenty of opportunity for expressive poses. This is the first figure I made that I could honestly say that I was happy with. He was sculpted entirely using green stuff, and while I've learned a lot since then, I feel that this was a good start. For this video, I'm going to go back to making kung fu figures, using techniques that I've learned in the years since then to make a pair of fighters. Once completed, I will be sending both figures to another miniature photographer who goes by Trini Photographer. You can see some of her photos here. And we're going to see what she does with them. I feel that when working on any project based on movies from the 70s, it's important to ask yourself, what would Quentin Tarantino do? So with that in mind, I decided to make the female character barefoot. The first step in this process was to take a pair of legs from the Masterbox pinup kit featured in my Gilda video and cut them at the knee to allow them to be repositioned. I then drilled some holes and ran a wire through the leg. This gave the leg a bit of flexibility and allowed me to try different poses to see what works. As I positioned the legs and torso, my primary consideration was in the expression of movement. The goal here was to try and show that she moves with speed and precision. Kung Fu is a kind of dance that at times is a little bit frightening, but they fight with expert timing. Now it was time to start sculpting the pants. It's important to only sculpt one leg at a time. Trying to do both at once might seem like a tempting idea, but the only thing I've ever succeeded at when I tried was getting fingerprints in all the wrong places. By the time I was ready to sculpt her tunic, I decided, at least in part, to base her costume on what Itsuko Shiomi wore in the 1974 classic Sister Street Fighter. Now this wasn't going to be an exact copy. I only intended to use the costume in that film as a starting point for what I was going to make. The biggest real dilemma I faced when sculpting this figure was deciding what to do with her arms. In many ways, Kung Fu is like jogging. When you see someone who isn't sure what their arms are supposed to do or where they're supposed to go, that's the first sign of a novice. This is also why running a wire through the limbs to make them posable is extremely useful. After trying a few things out, I finally found a pose I was happy with. And while I was at it, I also gave her some buttons. I then gave her some sleeves and sculpted her hair. At this point, I was prepared to say that I'd finished sculpting her, and it was time to move on to the next character. Now, of course, since this is Kung Fu, I needed to sculpt an enemy for her. My first step was to draw a basic skeleton outline on a picture of an old man in a pose that looked about right to me. To copy the posture, I took the hip from an existing figure and attached two pieces of wire that I planned to use as the legs. I then bent them into roughly the same position and formed some milliput around them to flesh them out. I scavenged his torso from another old figure, which I sanded down using my improvised Dremel tool. I then attached this to the rest of the figure. To make his pants, I spread some putty and shaped it around his calves. I didn't sculpt above the knee because it was going to be covered by the robe. I'm not sure what the Chinese name for this garment is, but it's similar to the Vietnamese ao dai. Now the robe was made with green stuff, which I rolled out and shaped around his legs. The nice thing about using this technique to make draped cloth is that you can allow the folds in the fabric to take shape naturally as you lay it on the figure. His tunic was made by spreading my usual green stuff and milliput blend over the torso, and then I made the beard using the same blend of putties. The arms were next. The forearms and hands were salvaged from parts of older figures that I had lying around. After feeding a wire through and posing them, I fleshed out the arms, and then I sculpted on some sleeves. At this point, I needed to add something that I should have done earlier, and that was to add a pair of villainous, bushy eyebrows. After that, I started on the hair. The reason I left the hair for last was because at one point I had considered making this guy bald, but after some consideration, I decided that a man bun made for a better bad guy hairstyle. Since these figures were going to be handled, I decided to paint them with acrylics instead of oil paints. I'd started by painting the faces. Lately I've been trying to use primary colors as much as possible when I'm painting, so for the most part both figures were painted only using red, yellow, blue, white, and black paints. When I started painting the white parts of the female character's costume, I began with an undercoat of beige because I wanted to get a warm white tone. Then I built up the highlights, going lighter and lighter as I went along. Part of the key to getting the right look for this project was that I needed to maintain a certain element of simplicity when designing the figures. For that reason, I felt that a simple black and white costume would suit her nicely. The male character needed a slightly bolder color scheme. This was because his character design was inspired by movies like Master of the Flying Guillotine and others like it. I also borrowed some design elements from Hergé's Tintin comics, particularly the Blue Lotus. At this point, I was happy with how this project had turned out, and I was ready to send the figures off to the Trini photographer. I'm looking forward to seeing what she does with them, and I'll be posting a link to her profile in the description, along with a couple links to kung fu movies that served as a bit of an inspiration here. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you have any questions or comments about the video, then by all means, leave them in the comments.